Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going on a massive journey. We're going to trace the very origins of human conflict, starting all the way back in prehistoric anthropology and bringing it right up to the intensely complex geopolitics of the modern Middle East. It is a fascinating look at how the way we organize our societies fundamentally dictates our propensity for violence.
But before we get into the modern stuff, we literally have to ask one of the biggest questions about human nature. Is war actually hardwired into our biology? Like, are we simply born to fight?
To figure that out, we're breaking this explainer down into 5 parts. Is war human nature? The preconditions for conflict, ideology and modern war, the tangible cost, and finally, biology over ideology.
All right, kicking things off with part 1, is war human nature? We're diving into the anthropological debate of our origins.
So anthropology today is basically split right down the middle into 2 camps. On one side, you've got the hawks. They argue that war is this evolved instinct to just eliminate competitors, a dark trait we supposedly carried ever since we shared a common ancestor with chimpanzees. But on the flip side, we have the doves, and they argue that armed conflict is actually a pretty recent invention, something that only popped up over recent millennia as our social conditions and the way we organize ourselves started to change.
And the visual proof archaeologists use to debate this is fascinating. Now, the absolute oldest cave art is super heavily debated, with Dobbs saying the wavy lines are just shamanic symbols, not actual spears. But when you look at later art from the Iberian Peninsula, it's crystal clear. Created by settled agriculturalists, it undeniably shows organized collective battles. So we know for sure that at a certain point in our history, organized warfare definitely became a reality. But the question is, was it always there?
Well, researchers even looked at our primate cousins to find out. If the hawks are right, chimps should be naturally warlike, right? But the data reveals a huge surprise. After analyzing over 400 years of combined chimpanzee observation data, researchers found that their most extreme violence, which was a kill rate of 1.67 per year, spiked almost entirely during brief periods of severe human disruption. For the vast majority of the time, without that external pressure, the kill rate plummeted to just 0.03 per year. This is a massive point for the dove argument. It suggests collective violence isn't just an everyday biological baseline, it needs very specific, stressful preconditions to ignite.
Which brings us to Section 2, the preconditions for conflict and when society shifted.
The sources point to some very specific societal sparks here, because think about it, you really don't get war without having something to fight over and the actual organization to pull it off. The sparks for collective violence included things like shifting from a roaming lifestyle to a sedentary one, growing regional populations, hoarding valuable resources, and setting up strict group boundaries. Once we finally settled down and built complex hierarchies, the logistical capacity and honestly the motivation for war was officially born. We can see this evolution so clearly when we compare different types of prehistoric societies. Take simple hunter-gatherers. They lived in mobile, egalitarian bands, hardly owned anything, and the archaeological record shows almost zero evidence of war among them. But complex hunter-gatherers? That's a totally different story. They built fixed settlements, established social rankings, and had political leaders restricting access to resources. And right there, right when that complex social organization kicks in, that is exactly where we start seeing the skeletal and archaeological evidence of deadly organized warfare.
Let's fast forward a bit to Section 3, Ideology and Modern War, looking at the drivers of modern geopolitical conflict.
To understand how this ancient dynamic plays out in the modern era, our sources look at an analysis by Middle East scholar Professor Mordecai Kadar. He argues that modern conflict is deeply tied to ideology. He specifically points to the historical concept of Hijra, the Prophet Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina. Now, Kadar analyzes this not just as a religious story, but as a deeply political model. In his view, this migration historically marked a transition from a persecuted idea into a structured government and military power. Essentially, it became a historical blueprint for establishing political dominance.
Now, it is absolutely crucial here to separate personal belief from political organization. According to Kadar's strict distinction, personal faith is entirely separate from what he labels Islamism. He argues that practicing the religion itself, like praying, giving to charity, dietary choices, is completely unproblematic. The friction arises with Islamism, which he strictly defines as the ideological and political imposition of those rules onto others. Just like with our complex hunter-gatherers, the conflict sparks when an organized group attempts to enforce its hierarchy and boundaries on everybody else.
Moving on to Section 4, the tangible cost, the modern price of ideological conflict.
It's currently estimated that rebuilding the physical infrastructure of Gaza alone is going to cost a staggering $70 billion. When facing astronomical numbers like that, people inevitably ask, well, couldn't a modern Marshall Plan bring peace to the Middle East? Just like it did in Europe after World War II? But based on Kadar's analysis, there's a massive flaw in that comparison. See, the Marshall Plan worked because it was applied to nations that had been utterly defeated and had completely surrendered their aggressive ideologies. In places like Gaza or Iran, pouring in billions of dollars just doesn't buy peace if the underlying societal structures are still driven by an ideology that fundamentally requires the destruction of an external enemy. The money doesn't fix the root cause.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, Biology over Ideology, an unconventional framework for peace. Professor Kadar's central argument categorizes the different types of societal structures we see in the Middle East today. He argues that groups driven by nationalism or theology inherently require an external enemy. They need that enemy to galvanize their factions and maintain control. But he points out that states and local clans driven by biology, and by biology he means deep family and tribal ties, like the United Arab Emirates or local clans within Gaza, they function completely differently. According to his analysis, these biologically based structures literally don't need an external enemy to survive. Their primary focus naturally shifts inward. They care about internal stability, hierarchy, and building the economy.
Building on this concept, Kadar proposes something he calls the Emirate solution. He suggests that rather than empowering broad ideological or theological governments, the international community should actually empower local, family-based clans to govern their own cities. By capitalizing on biological family ties, which he argues are way stronger than any political ideology, you effectively remove the necessity for that unifying external enemy. Governance naturally shifts toward internal stability and economic growth, entirely bypassing those ideological sparks that ignite modern warfare.
So, tying this all together, what should we really take away from this explainer? Well, whether we're looking at complex hunter-gatherers settling down 10,000 years ago, or modern nation-states and political organizations navigating the Middle East right now, the fundamental truth seems to remain exactly the same. The way a society is structured and the way it organizes its people and its resources ultimately dictates its propensity for violence.
I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. We've seen that collective killing isn't some unavoidable biological curse, it's a byproduct of complex societal organization and ideology. If we practically invented war by drawing borders and imposing complex ideologies on each other, is the key to lasting peace simply bypassing all of that and returning to the oldest, most fundamental biological roots of human family? It's a wildly provocative idea, and one that forces us to completely rethink everything we know about the architecture of peace.